Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Aputure and its new Storm XT52, the industry's most powerful LED point source light. Brighter than a 6K HMI and powered by Aputure's revolutionary Blair light engine, the Storm XT52 is both a tunable white light and also the brightest ever adjustable color LED. Storm XT52, unrivaled output, only from Aputure. Today we're speaking with a gaffer. His credits are many and include Joker, West Side Story, and Leave the World Behind. We're pleased to welcome Steve Ramsey. Steve, thank you for doing this.
Hi, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you so much, you guys.
Yeah.
So good to see you.
This is going to be fun. And we'll start the fun by asking the question, how did you get to where you are today? Were you a kid that noticed when there was a dark corner in a room and liked it? Or did you not even notice that at all and want to become something else and find it later? What's your story?
Well, the dark corner. I wasn't expecting the dark corner question.
I know. I wasn't either. It just came up.
I don't know. Yeah, I probably was afraid of dark corners very early on, but
Yeah, it's nothing to do with lighting.
no. I did like art as a kid, and I loved drawing, and I grew up at a time where, when there was, you'd go places and there was no iPad at the time to be shoved into my hands or a nearby TV or anything like that. So sometimes that was a pad of paper and a pencil and all right, have fun. So there was that. But, in terms of, did I know I was going to be a gaffer one day? No, I had no idea that was, that was my future. And I had no idea what a gaffer was.
Most people don't.
You know what? That's so true. It's it's one of the more unfortunate, I think, crew titles, honestly. It really is. It really doesn't. It's so not descriptive. It's funny because after I did a bunch of early gaffer credits or jobs where I'd gotten gaffer credit, and my parents still didn't know since I was still young, and my parents still didn't really understand me being in the business and what my objectives were, or even what the business was. My mother finally saw a movie where I had gotten credited as the chief lighting technician. And my mother saw that movie, and she called me up and said, "Stephen, I saw that movie." I said, "What a credit." And I didn't have the heart to tell her. It was like, well, it's it's kind of the same job that you didn't understand before,
Right.
but I'm glad it made you happy, and that's that's important. That's very important to me. So, but it was funny.
But did you like movies as a kid?
I did. I definitely did. And, I grew up in Rochester, New York, which is the home of Kodak. But as kids,
Right.
my father worked at Kodak that was his first job and his last job. So he came out of World War II and worked there for about 46 plus years straight. And so Kodak was always in our lives, but he was in photo finishing and, we were in Rochester. So it's not only were we not on the West Coast, we were the East Coast, but not the East Coast. It was like the wrong coast of the East Coast. We were off the coast of Lake Ontario. So we were really isolated in a world where we felt totally separate from Hollywood. So it might as well have been a different universe, The quick story that could have been, my dad was at work at Kodak and I became a gaffer because I was involved with film production, and that one thing led to the next. It's like that. There was no quick connection there. That was a dead end.
Yeah.
But we love movies, and I was a child of the 70s, so I'm sure you've heard this story plenty of times, and I even hate to say it, but yes, Star Wars was a big moment in my life, and
For everybody,
I know. It's just like,
Get it.
it's like, skip to the next section, right? But
Yeah.
honestly, I was 7 years old when or 6 or 7, or I was probably both 6 and 7. It was out in the theater for a year, and I probably grew up with it
Yeah.
over the single release of it. But, as a 7-year-old, seeing it in its original theatrical release, there was no intellect that I was bringing to it. So it was no chance to repel any of it or question any of it. Just went right through my eyes, right to my heart and soul. And And I guess it kind of turned the world, I guess, into, a bunch of 7-year-olds, for better or for worse.
Yeah, right. It's funny, so many people quote Star Wars as being so significant in their lives and careers. I mean, I was on a yacht miles from anywhere at the time Star Wars came out. But also Star Wars was like a milestone in the evolution of film. I mean, it was the start of film changing into what we see today. It was the start of, a world that led to Avatar, frankly, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
Well, and it also, they had this science fiction, but the robots and everything were dirty. Everything wasn't pristine.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that was a radical. Yeah, there were no dirty spaceships until that movie came out. It seemed.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but how did you get from loving Star Wars to actually working in film?
When you saw the movie, did you think, I want to do this? Or did you think that was a possibility? Or did you enjoy it?
It was a couple of things. I mean, it was the advent of the summer blockbuster. So every year there was another almost equivalent experience as I grew up. So, by the time I was 10, it was Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I was just, when I saw Goonies, I was the same age as the kids in the Goonies, or Stand By Me. It was just, I felt like the movies were literally being like every year that, okay, we'll make the movie for 7-year-olds in 1977, then we'll make a movie for 8-year-olds in 1978. And it just seemed to follow suit. But I was watching more games as I was approaching like teenage years. So it just was uncanny. By the time PG-13 movies came out the year I turned 13. So it just was tailor-made for my age just to get me hooked into it. But also, it was the first time I remember there being behind the scenes and the making of Star Wars and things like this. So it was sort of like, hey, look how they made these movies, and all, of course, all the special effects and all the, they're so rich with things that you had wondered how they did it, and that was always
That's actually really interesting. I never thought of that. The fact that those type of things started to come out makes you think, oh, it is a job.
Made it feel more accessible.
Right.
That's really interesting.
There's a bunch of adults putting this together and figuring out, inventing these things and building spaceships out of model kits and things like this. It's like, it was a lot like things you'd play, it's like I was playing with model kits too. So it's almost like a, direct line in that sense. Like, oh, maybe this is something to do. But I mean, I honestly never, at that point I wasn't thinking career at all. So it was just, I was just consuming, consuming and reacting. But my brother was the big, I had 3 older siblings. I was the youngest. So it was mom and dad and my 2 sisters who were 6 and 8 years older than me. And my brother who's 10 years older than me. He was the big movie buff really and then he sort of took me under his wing, and I would watch movies with him. And of course, the movies we saw on TV were all the older movies and all the old horror movies and sci-fi and things with monsters and lasers and spaceships. And that was that was the extent of what I could understand at that point. So I would follow in his footsteps a little bit, and watch things. He would kind of curate me through things that I was able to watch with him. And he was also watching, he was 10 years older, so he was watching kind of also more grown-up stuff, and I kind of looked up to him, and I wanted to sort of get to where he was, but my brain just was not developed enough to understand, elaborate plots and characters and things like that. I had no appreciation for that, or I had no understanding of it. It's like it was just too intellectual for me. But he knew all about all the classic movies, like he knew, Gone with the Wind and Citizen Kane, and he knew about these movies. And funny, one time I walked in and he was watching a black and white movie, and I didn't know what it was at the time, but it turned out it was Casablanca. And it was the beginning of Casablanca, and where they have the map of Casablanca, and they're showing that the line being drawn to Casablanca, where everybody's sort of trying to escape out of Europe. And I saw the map, and I thought to myself, oh, this is just like Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm going to say something to my brother, and I'm going to impress him, that I'm now a critical movie viewer now, and I'm going to say something intelligent. So I said, Mark, this is just like Raiders of the Lost Ark. And he kind of turned back at me with this look on his face, and he said, no. He said, Raiders of the Lost Ark is just like this. So he was schooling me in the ways of, the respect, you got to respect your elders and you got to respect your classics, at the same time. So, but he knew I was interested in it. And he bought me the Leonard Maltin guide. I feel like I'm sure people have mentioned that too at some point. It's like the way they learned about movies. And I just wanted to try to train myself as to, how to watch movies and what were good movies. And I, would sort of curl up with that book and kind of page through and find 4-star movies and put an earmark on the page, and I started to learn directors, reviewed the movie and told you about the movie, but also gave you the director. And if it looked good, it would mention the cinematography. So it, started seeing these familiar names and, things like Caleb Deschanel and Vittorio Storaro and all these other frankly kind of beautiful names too. It's like they weren't, it wasn't just the photographers, like, wow, even the name sounds beautiful. So these guys sound like artists. So I started watching better movies and I kind of, almost forced myself to watch, like, I'm just going to watch this Ingmar Bergman movie and see if I can, if I don't like it, then there's something wrong with me. So let me just train myself to appreciate these things. And I had a friend in high school that once my brother went, as we grew up, my brother went off to college and moved out of the house. And I found a friend in high school who I kind of hooked into watching movies. Occasionally I said, oh, here, I recorded this, The Ruling Class, it's a 4-star movie. Let's watch that, or Oh Lucky Man, or, these movies that are kind of abstract and kind of challenging to figure out. And we watched those together. And so then I think it time for me to go to college. And, this is a point where in perfect timing for me to go into film school, but I went into computer science instead because I was...
Oh, was it because you thought you'd be more likely to get a job in computer science than film?
Well, yes. I felt, even though, I was 16, coming out of high school or 17, it's like, exactly. I thought, I love movies, but let me just try to be responsible and be respectful to my parents and, and my whole community and sort of follow in the expected footsteps. And also, I kind of, in retrospect, I kind of blame War Games, the movie, for getting me into computers because it was so sexy, and you were breaking into, changing your grades, hacking into the systems and stuff like that. So that was all very cool. So and I was into programming and things like, so it wasn't a completely out of left field choice, but quickly figured out that here I was in a class in college and looking around and people were passionate about it. And it was a little bit too dry for me, classes like algorithms and data structures and discrete logic. And it was like, there was no game to it. It was all dry for me. And I felt like, okay, this is not a good feeling, that I'm not really excited at this moment. So meanwhile, my friend from high school went right into film school. So I thought, I got him into it. I got him interested in the first place. Why don't I do that? So I started changing track, started changing my major, and I was at a school that had no arts program. It was Villanova, which was outside of Villanova University, which is outside of Philadelphia. And there was no anybody to even talk to about movies, let alone, everybody was an engineer or a business major or something like that. So, but I did take a film class there, and it was the only A+ I got, anywhere near an A+ that I got for that entire my 2 years there. And I felt good. And suddenly I felt like I was the most passionate person in the room. And I felt like, this feels good. I'm doing the right thing here. So it kind of reinforced that. And I got it. I think what I imagined was a good recommendation from a recommendation letter from my film teacher. And it was funny because she was asking me, okay, which film schools are you looking at? And I sort of went down the list and I kind of got to NYU at the end. And I said, well, of course, NYU, because that's sort of a legendary school. And that would be, if I got into there, if I got into NYU, I'd have to go there for sure. And she sort of shuddered and sort of said, like, well, gosh, I really hate to see kids go to New York City.
Wow.
Oh.
So a real negative.
Wow.
And I knew what she meant because she's looking at me thinking, okay, here's this, this quiet kid who's sheltered and this ex-altar boy from Western New York who's, who's probably going to get chewed up and spat out or corrupted, even worse, corrupted, by the big city and come to no end, no good end. And I knew exactly what she meant because I felt the same. I felt the same thing. It's like, chances are this could happen. It could go that way. So that was kind of funny. So that was sort of lingering in my mind, I got to say, as I moved on from there. But
did you end up going to NYU?
I did. I got it.
Despite what she said.
I did.
Wow.
And I said, you know what? I just have to go for it. I just got to do it. I got to try. If I fail, at least I'm this is my B plan. So I had no C plan. I did computer science, film. So it's like, this better work, something better come of this. So I don't know where it leads. I don't know how I turned it into it's like, I don't know when I'm going to become a director in this business, but
Well, when you got there, did you immediately know this was right? Did it just feel right away?
It did. And part of what was great about NYU was that New York City was the biggest. I think if it was a film school,
evil spot.
Yeah, exactly. It smelled, it was dirty in all the right ways. So it was all very inspiring to my kind of sheltered suburban eyes. So it was great.
Yeah. So when you went into NYU, were you thinking of being a director? I'm just curious how you ended up finding that you wanted to do lighting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, yes, it for sure. It's thinking, well, because it was also one of the few roles on the film I understood, or I thought I understood.
Right.
I thought, well, there's the director and then there's everybody else. And then, then I get, Caleb Deschanel or Vittorio Storaro to shoot the thing and I'm good.
You had it all planned out.
Yeah, exactly. We'll just team up and there it is. But no, so I had no acting background. I had no theater background. So I was sort of, afraid of, a little hesitant to get into that area too much. And I was sort of shy a little bit in that sense. So I sort of stuck with the technical and which was fine because I enjoyed, like it's going back to all those Star Wars making of behind the scenes specials, it was all the technical stuff was really kind of exciting to me. So of course we were working 16 millimeter film and, with these cameras that were just the Arri-S camera from, it looked like it fell off of a tank at the end of World War II. It just was unbelievable. I was so surprised at the lack of technology in film. It was just a shocking lack of technology for the longest time, right? Now it's a whole different, it's swung the other way so far that it's almost unbelievable in the other direction. But at the time it was funny. So, so I was glad to have, in retrospect, I've had all the experience, handling film and learning how to use a light meter and all these other, and all those other technical things.
So did you want to go into camera then? And didn't you work as an AC when you came out?
Yes, if you go deep enough into my IMDb credits, you can find a few. Yeah, there's a few secrets I couldn't quite hide.
Delete.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, I was in a naive sort of way. I figured, well, if I want to get into cinematography, and that was what I was excited about. Got to be near the camera, and I got to understand how to use the cameras, and so it was, how to load the cameras and all this stuff. So it was my launch was in that direction to start learning more. And but of course, as many people realize that this, it was very hard to, I figured I'll get a job at a camera rental house. Those jobs were few and far between, and the camera crews were small, and so basically I found an easier access to getting into the lighting world a little bit. So because there were more bigger crews and that kind of thing. But,
right.
Yeah. So
can you describe exactly, since nobody knows what the term means, what a gaffer does? Do this for your mother, okay?
Oh, right. I got to tell you one story that's pretty funny. I think that my family came to visit me on set. Not my parents. My parents passed away. So, but my wife and kids came to visit me, and my younger son, my two boys, and my younger son was about probably 11 or 12 at the time. And they're watching, they're just watching what's going on set, and they're seeing me talk to the DP, and then I'd walk over and I'd talk to the lighting crew, and I'd go back and talk to the DP, and go back to talk to the lighting crew, and my son was watching this happen, and my son finally came up to me at one point and said, "Hey, Dad, I really like your job." And I said, "Oh, that's so sweet of you to say." It's like I'm getting excited. It's like, "Oh, wow, is he passionate about this?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I said, what do you like about it?" And he said, "Well, somebody tells you what to do, and then you tell other people what to do." and it was, it's like that clear-eyed vision of what, like it's so simple, but yet that's fundamentally kind of what it is, and if you really break it down to its essence, I guess, yes, I am taking one person's ideas and communicating it to other people.
Yeah.
So, but in a broader, more descriptive way, it would be taking, I guess, the cinematographer's do all the equipment and crew and staffing and all the organization to make sure to pull off the cinematographer and the director's vision. I guess that would be the sort of the more clinical way of explaining it to somebody.
And I suppose it depends on the cinematographer and the way that they work, because I know, for instance, Roger likes to plan it all out and with collaboration from the gaffer, but has a very clear idea of where those lights are going. But then other DPs, it seems, want to tell the gaffer, this is the idea that I'm going for, come up with it. Have you found that to be true, that it's two different styles? Very different.
It really, yes, it really is. And that's what's, I gotta say, that's one of the fun things about it, is because you do get to sort of change speeds, and either sometimes you do need to assume more responsibility, and other times you're with you both, Roger, you would give me those very specific plans, and which was surprising to me, because I was used to, prior to that, I was used to being the one to make those plans. And I remember Mitch Lillian, our dear friend in Key Grip, because he introduced us all. So, so that was, so he was enjoying my first experience working with you. And he saw me get the plans the first time, and he kind of laughed. And he said, "Look, Steve, I guess you don't need to do the plans anymore." And it was kind of an adjustment, because I thought, well, you know what? I still need to make my own plans, because that's my process. So it's like, I still need, for my own process, I still need to do those plans. So it was sort of, but of course I wasn't starting from scratch, and I gotta say, prep can be very lonely when you're the only one making plans. So it was nice to have a plan making partner. I gotta say.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, how does sort of prep evolve for you as a gaffer in general terms, and then how does it change from, say, working with Vittorio Storaro, who eventually you got to work with, and
which is funny, several times, a couple of times,
or with Janusz or somebody, they must have sort of different processes.
Completely different
what is that
processes,
sort of formula?
Well, just going through those two examples, Vittorio, also very specific. He would also give me, if it was a bigger set, for sure, he would give me his plan, but his was a little less high tech than yours, in the sense that it was just hand drawn, with all of his lights being hand drawn, very neatly, and it's like, I'm sure he'd been doing it for years the same way. So he was very, very specific, and very specific on the tech scouts as well. He would stand exactly where he wanted the light, and if you were off by even a couple inches, he would, "No, that's not where it goes."
He would know.
Yeah, and I would think, well, that's where you stood. And he said, "No, it's got to go over here." And he would point an inch to the left. It's like, oh, okay, well, all right. I guess I was wrong.
And isn't he also very concerned with color? Because everything was so colorful. So does that require lots of filters that you have to think about ahead of time and get on the right light?
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. Well, we all, a lot of people have seen his color theory presentation. And actually the first time I met him was, at his hotel, and, he invited me up, and we're sitting, in his suite, and he kind of sat me down, and he gave me a front row seat explanation of his color theory. And I thought, I'm getting a private, intimate sort of presentation all my own. This is like and I felt bad, because to a certain extent, it's like, I've already heard this, but because I watched all this, it's like I've been following him for all these years. So it's like, but it was great to hear it from him directly, and very exciting. But so he's very into assigning meaning to the colors. And one thing he did say was, because the films that I'd worked with him on were Woody Allen films. And he said, well, for years, Woody Allen's films have been kind of coming out of the Gordon Willis in the very muted tones and the overcast days and things like that. He said that he wasn't sure, when Woody first called him, if it was right for him, because that's not the way he saw the world, and not the way he saw that wasn't the work that necessarily excited his senses. So after reading the scripts, he sort of realized that, okay, well, he thought he had a way of introducing color. He thought he had that the scripts gave him an opportunity to make a case for using color, and that's how that was sort of his road into doing those.
And was Woody okay with that? Because he's so New York, and New York is normally seen as gray, not particularly colorful.
I know it. We were, I think Woody just let him do I never witnessed the conversation. And I came in on the second job they did together. So there was a transitional period on the first film. I wasn't privy to that. But it's funny because one of our camera tests, we had Kate Winslet, and who you guys know and worked with. And she was standing in, and the set was that we were shooting a test, and the lights were down, and she's standing in place. And we'd set up all of Vittorio's, he was using all tungsten light at this time. Now he's switched to LED, but he was using all the tungsten lights, very powerful, very directional, arrays of par bulbs and things like that. And all his kind of custom lights that he developed over the years with his Italian gaffer. And they were so hot, he would leave them off as much as possible until we got ready to shoot, and then he'd bring them up because otherwise it would heat up the set.
Yeah.
And a lot of the bulbs were also had a very short lifespan, which was tricky for us on the electric side because once they hit their lifespan, they might blow up, so that was a very kind of like, it was very, it's funny because I've had a lot of people since sort of mentioned like, oh, we'll use those lights that Vittorio used. And I said, you can, but here's one thing that you might want to think about. It's like they might, some bulbs occasionally pop, in the middle of a scene and you have to start over. So for both those reasons, he was very judicious about turning them on and turning them off, and everything was run through his dimmer board that we gave him. So he'd have the DIT monitor, and then below that he'd have a dimmer board, console, and he would operate the lights kind of like he was playing an instrument.
Wow.
In sort of poetic terms. And I think so. You keep the lights down until he needed them, until we were ready to roll. So okay, we'd be ready. We'd have tested each of these lights and focused them and things like that, and then he'll bring them all down, and then only when you're ready to roll do you really get the sense of seeing it all together. And so, okay, Vittorio, you ready to go? Okay, yes, I'm ready. And he brings the Grandmaster up, and suddenly that gray, dim environment turns into this lush, warm, and this big, strong backlight comes on the back of Kate Winslet, and her head is like, it's like an aura of light around her. And Susie, who was our costume designer on the job, she was very funny and very cute with Vittorio. She said, "Oh, Vittorio, you are Italian."
I'm interested when you said earlier that Vittorio was very specific about where he wanted the light, and it was like inches off it would be wrong. But so on a film like Wonder Wheel, was that in prep when you scouted or talked about sets? Was it all shot listed? Was it storyboarded? Did you know exactly? How do you put a light exactly in one spot and you can shoot a scene around it if it's a big rig?
Right.
And did you pre-light, and that whole balance between pre-lighting and storyboarding, and then a director that comes in and wants to just be spontaneous?
Right. Well, the funny thing about working with Woody is that he kind of shows up and to a certain extent anticipates that the DP is going to kind of present something to him, I think. It's a little bit, they don't do a lot of talking, and sort of, Vittorio would sort of present an idea and propose, he would say, I have a proposal. And he would propose an idea, and then they'd maybe modify that and then go with it. But and it's funny because I think it was at odds a little bit with the way Vittorio saw working, because one of the things that Vittorio is very insistent upon is that he takes exception to the term DP, director of photography, and he says that he said there's only one director on set, therefore I am not the director of photography, I am the cinematographer. So I think it was a little bit, and again, I missed the transitional first time that Woody and Vittorio worked together, but I think that was probably a surprise for Vittorio, that he had to kind of assume a little bit of that responsibility and become a little bit of a DP suddenly, in the directing part of that word. But as far as
interesting,
But as far as placing lights, specifically thinking of some of the bigger setups where it was more of an architectural, we'd set up a row of lights to rake the Coney Island cyclone, to look like sunrise, or so it was, and that maybe in some of the broader senses for those big scenes. And then once we got onto the stage, some of that the really specific inches this way or that way would be more in relation to kind of hiding lights. And he was very good at hiding very big units, behind very small parts of the set. So I felt the Steadicam operator had his hands full, kind of trying to follow these long dialogue scenes with very complicated blocking, and also thread the needle and not catch a light, hiding around every corner. So it was it was very tricky.
Right.
Yeah.
And
That's why I always liked operating, because I knew where my light was.
exactly, and could avoid it. Is part of your job to, as the idea of what the lighting's going to be develops, to indicate, well, we'll never get this done in time, we need a pre-rig day? And how much pushback do you get sometimes when you're saying, we got to have an extra day in here?
Yeah, no, that's definitely one of the anxieties of prep.
Yeah.
Is picking your battles, I guess, right? It's like when, and some producers are particularly sensitive to certain bits, certain types of equipment, and certain words like pre-light or weekend work is another one that always gets their attention in a bad way. So I think, a lot of times I do feel the burden of that does fall upon the gaffer to define some of those. Sometimes the cinematographers make the push and sort of represent that, and sometimes they've got their hands full, maybe working with a new director, and they're just preoccupied with other things, and you sort of have to meet them halfway and just sort of swoop in to support them and just remind them that this would be really helpful, I think, for your process if we get this
but
off
also
the plate.
As the gaffer, you're thinking it logistically. You're thinking, okay, so we've got 5 of these kind of lights, but 7 of those, and we're going to have to rig it over here. So you're the one, even more so than other people, that know how long that takes to do each of those things. And surely the argument has to be at one point, if we do this on the day, you're going to either have a very long day or a very short scene.
Right,
your choice.
Right. And then not to mention the anxieties and the effects of those anxieties on the people involved directly with all those factors. So it's just on the emotional level. It's just like, let's address the emotional level and make sure everybody's. We're going to go in there with a certain comfort in our or at least knowledge in our heads that we at least might succeed. let's not put ourselves behind the 8 ball right away and just and dig a hole for ourselves where we have to figure out complex blocking and rig a whole thing around it. So having an opportunity to work on the Spielberg movies with Janusz is a good example of kind of trying to protect against the possibilities, because Steven is very instinctual about what he's doing, and you never exactly know what he's going to do. I mean, of course, we've all read the script, and sometimes he's on the scout to explain it, and we go in armed with our basic understanding of it. But it's kind of like what I explained to sometimes the producers when I'm having to make, like you're saying, make the case for these pre-lights and rigs. I'd say, like, well, think of it this way: we have to build a bubble of protection around Steven. We cannot put him in the corner, but we could try. It's not going to work. I mean, you could say, well, I mean, and nobody's going to say, well, Steven, we really kind of have to keep this, into, tight coverage. We can't really go wide on, it's like nobody's going to, so, everybody's there to enable him to be the director that he's always been to us since we've been watching his movies, so,
But in a way, though, surely the producers working with him know that. So you know that this is the way that he works. So know that this is going to come up and you're going to be, don't they? You would think.
They do, and I think, but they, of course, they've got the studio talking in their other ear, and and they're sort of in a little bit of a vice grip of trying to reconcile and sort of mediate, and sometimes they. And they're also comparing it to, well, here's another big movie. How come this is such a different, like, especially if they're producers that are maybe new to the to that family.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And they're coming off of, well, this is $100 million movie, and how come they operated differently? And it's like, well, it's because it's a different process. It's just he's gonna, if he's inspired by something on the day and he sees something, he's not going to limit himself.
Right.
If he finds a good way to tell the story, A, why would you want to talk him out of that? And then B, you couldn't if you wanted to. So,
But then as part of your job, when you hear what Janusz or the DP wants to do in a case like that, as part of your job, thinking, well, if we didn't do it quite this way, but did it this way, it's more movable if things change. I mean, is that going through your mind constantly? Make it as flexible as possible?
yeah, definitely. And I think that's part of that sort of bubble of protection kind of like idea is that you're protecting them not only in allowing them to look 360, but you're also making sure that you're not in the way of, you're not going to put a massive immovable object, within that sphere of protection, it's
Right.
like, so you have to be able to kind of get out of the way. And, it's funny, he moves so fast, and those sets are such a high energy kind of, they're exhilarating, but they're very high energy and very active, and you're moving things around and you're relighting from shot to shot to a degree that is, almost kind of in a classical way. It's like you're not just setting a source and everybody gravitates around it. You're sort of maintaining I mean, it's different from movie to movie, but I'm thinking kind of West Side Story, for example. It was, they went from one kind of classical looking kind of lighting composition within a single shot to another classical lighting composition. It wasn't, didn't get, too front lit. Well, there was a certain amount of front lighting, that was really kind of like harkening back to the older classical films. But for example, when we were in doing the dance at the gym, and there's a big introductory shot that takes the characters down a hallway and then through the doors that open into a gym, and then it's a steady cam move that stitches into a cable cam that then rises up, goes over the dancers, goes to the other side of the gym, descends back down, and then stitches back into a third camera, which is another steady cam. Obviously, we knew that the cable cam rig was there, and we knew that was going to be the shot, but we didn't know exactly what that shot was going to necessarily see. And there was a lot of, kind of negotiations about, how to rig for that shot, and also have a set that you could photograph, so,
Because a lot of people's solution to that would be just light it so you can shoot 360
Like
with
flat light it,
flat light with no molding, no nothing. But so
right.
I don't think people realize that that's the easy way, but then there is oftentimes you're absolutely not trying to do that, and how hard it is. And yet you could be making it so much easier, but you can't if you're going to do that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And this was not contemporary movie, and it wasn't. It's funny because we did the one day we had to. It was both actually a pre-light and a dance rehearsal. And of course, the dance rehearsal wore on and on and on. And I'm watching the time. I'm watching the time now and saying, like, this is okay now. At this point, how much time do I have to focus each one of these lights? It's like it's getting down to like, okay, I'm at the 2 minute, part, mark where I got to focus each one of these, 100 something lights in 2 minutes a piece, or else we're not going to, be able to pre-light.
Yeah.
But, we wanted it to look classical. So, when that camera's on one side of the gym, all the backlights are on, and, and it's looking classically backlit. And then when that camera goes up and over the audience, then we're doing a crossfade, then looking the other direction to have the other backlights come up on a dimmer. One side goes down, one side comes up. So that's something that, with Steven, you have to be ready for those kinds of dynamic changes, because, when we were doing, it's funny, at the beginning when we were doing the dance rehearsal, we were kind of keeping lights kind of low, so it didn't heat up for the dancers. And so we had a bunch of LED space lights, because most of our other lights were actually old school tungsten lights, which is a whole other reason for that. But we just had the space lights on, and it kind of looked kind of contemporary in a way, because it was just like what you were saying, it was like just top lit and kind of beautiful in its own way. But funny, because Janusz came in, he said, "Oh, Stevie, this looks so beautiful, but Steven will never let us do it." So he said, "Steven will never let us do it," because we were locked into this aesthetic that was it had to be that backlit sort of glamorous, old, kind of old movie lighting. And
Yeah. But that's great that they were conscious of the aesthetic and they wanted to maintain it. That's good. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, one of the first scouts, it wasn't even a tech scout. It was one of the first, I think, scouts that anybody went on West Side Story. And I was lucky to be there, just to be a part of it. And, there was only a handful of us there. It was me, Janusz, Steven, maybe the production design, maybe not even, and the location person and ED. And Stephen we were up in Harlem and looking at a street that was going to be one of the potentially one of the streets they used for the song America, where Anita and her two friends are walking down this street towards camera, and the camera's sort of tracking back and they're singing. And Stephen said, he's kind of he's got his hands up and he's making the frame and he's walking backwards. Like, okay, so they'll be walking towards us this way and we'll be tracking back and I want this to be lit. And Janusz said, "Yeah, yes, Stephen, yes, it will definitely be lit." and Stephen said, "No. I mean, I want to see arcs in their eyes. I want to see arc lights in their eyes." And Janusz said, Janusz said, "Okay, all right, Stephen, yes, we will do it. There won't be arcs, but yes, we'll have lights." So, but I was very happy to be there and hear that, because we're all wondering, none of us have made musicals before, and are we going to be faithful to the original in some way, or are we trying to modernize it? It's like, so what direction? So just overhearing him say that sort of right there explained our approach. It really told us that, we were going to make it, elevate it to a point where it was an expressionistic sort of, old, more theatrical kind of, reminiscent of that kind of photography, and which for me, it was like, okay, well, not only have I not done a musical, but I don't know if I've done that kind of lighting either. So,
yeah. But do you ever work from other visual references, whether it be like photographs or from past movies or something? Do you ever sit and watch an old movie and say, this is the kind of way we want to go?
Whether somebody, whether it's the cinematographer or the director, if somebody else is providing that information, of course, then I'll watch it. And then, if they don't, then I'll probably take it upon myself to kind of get my head, kind of wrapped around it, just so I can kind of, begin to think about how we would go about doing that. So, yeah, I definitely, with West Side Story, I didn't go back and watch the original because I figured, that's going to be too on the nose for, I'd like, let's clearly we're not trying to replicate it. We're just trying to, honor it in some way. So I did, I watched American in Paris, and I watched a few other things, and I watched some more modern, I watched The Greatest Showman, just to see, okay, what are modern musicals doing? And we had this whole conversation too about, like, I think Janusz had watched Chicago, and he was kind of getting a little bit, starting to question the idea of, like, do we need a lighting designer to come on board? Are we going to go into this theatrical direction? And West Side Story was mostly shot really on location, which was sort of one of the biggest distinctions between it and the original, was that, that was one of the kind of the fun things about it, was we actually got out on the streets and we weren't sort of studio bound as much. So,
well, I had another question, because it seems like it would have been similar problems of hiding the lights and everything as Leave the World Behind, because there are some shots, we were watching it the other day, and there are some shots where you're going one way and then, whoa, the camera comes back the other way.
It's a real roving camera, and it seems it's frankly to the point of distraction. It's a roving camera, but it must be quite a challenge when you have something like that. Again, was that storybook?
Yeah, how planned?
How do you plan?
That one was very planned, and the director was very, very much, he was extremely focused. Like, it's funny because each project, different people are focused on different things, and they have different priorities, and some are more performance and some are more visual, and and on that one, the director was very focused on executing these camera moves, and he was just that was a priority. That was the style, and it's the fun thing about working on all these different jobs. It's like this, suddenly we're having to turn this set into, because we had a location house, the real house, and then we built a replica of the kind of at least the most of the first floor, plus some of the patio and the pool out and back on a stage. Yeah, so So we could perform some of these moves, with cameras going through walls and through floors and, and through cabinets, and it had to be very modular. The ceiling had to go up, but the ceiling had maybe a chandelier on it. So, well, the camera is going above the chandelier, but below the ceiling. Okay, well, that means the ceiling will go up, and then the chandelier will have to individually then drop. So it was kind of a child's play set. You had to sort of, everything had to be movable, but yet independent also. So a lot of moving pieces that we had to track.
And it's also kind of different than when you were working with Steven. Yes, things had to be movable, but you didn't know where or why because you weren't sure exactly where that bubble would go, on the day. But this one, at least you came in each day knowing, supposedly, unless things changed, where that camera was going. So that's a really different experience.
It was a different experience. And because those cameras were so precious to the director that, we made sure that we knew how we were going to implement those things. And the grips did a great job, and construction did an amazing job of making all these sets, sort of break apart into pieces and come back together. And
another thing, do you think about putting practicals when you're building a set? Well, I guess you were working from a real house.
Well, I got to say, the interesting thing between like working on the films you've done with Janusz, like Bridge of Spies or A West Side Story, or working on this film we're talking about, Leave the World Behind, then you go to working with Larry Sher on Joker. I mean, Joker seemed much more a practical job. Like you built the light into the sets or the night exteriors. It seemed to me, the way it looked anyway, you didn't use the kind of huge lighting rigs that you had on, say, Bridge of Spies.
Yes, it was much more practical, light driven, for sure. And Larry has he's kind of boiled it down very succinctly for the set decorators and the set dressers. And what he repeats over and over is it's form and function. Those are a great combination of words to explain what we're looking for. And you can get something that looks good on camera, but it's got to, if you've got a couple people around a counter and you've got a lamp hanging between them, and that lamp is supposed to be lighting them, but it doesn't do anything for them. Well, that's a problem. That's going to upset the whole flavor of our lighting approach. If we suddenly have a scene that looks like we're doing this highly realistic thing, suddenly it looks like we're doing a scene out of like The Sting or something, where it looks like, artificial.
Yeah. So does that change the way, though, that you look at the lighting? Because you're thinking, okay, if we're trying to use practicals, what if we put a lamp over there? Because then it would bring light from this point of the room. Do you start thinking that way
to
suggest things like that?
And you give yourself probably more practicals than you'd ever need, just so you have. You can always turn. You can always get rid of it or turn it off, or something. Yeah. So it's you don't want to get into it's like that's always the danger of starting with a day scene in a set and maybe not leaning on the practicals for the day scene. Then now let's go to the night scene, and we really could have used a lamp here. I mean, we had all that sun streaming through the window, but now I wish we had a lamp that was established in that spot, yesterday. So it's tricky. So you have to.
Exactly.
But that's what we do. We look out for those things. We worry constantly for a reason, so we don't have those kinds of mistakes. So
yeah. And with practicals, you're also determining what kind of bulbs are going in there, because some bulbs are brighter than others. So sometimes you don't want that practical to be really bright, and sometimes you do, right? So you have to go through them and see what bulbs they take.
For sure. And of course, these days, half the lights coming in are LEDs, and that's become a kind of I would say a problem, but it's, let's call it a challenge, because we're trying to solve it. We're not going to live with the problem. We're going to try to solve this challenge. And that challenge being, kind of bringing the electric, the lighting department and the set decorating departments closer together, where, there's in fact so close that we need to overlap now. So that's the thing. We really can't have one acting, independently of the other and just presenting these things at the last minute or on the day of the shoot that we haven't seen, because we, need to, make sure that, we need to get this in front of the camera. If we need to live with what's in there for any reason, we need to make sure that there's no issues with it. And, some people are sensitive to the color of these things, and when they pick them, and sometimes they're not, and they show up and it's like you've got this warm candlelit scene, and you get presented with LED lights that are cool and blue in the middle of the table, and they say, "Oh, can you use these?" And it's like, well, no, actually, no.
Yeah.
Not really.
Yeah.
Or also they have a light and the shades are on it. They bring it in and a shade makes it all yellow, but you don't want
Right.
it yellow. It's a daylit
For sure.
and whatever. So all of those things, because they're looking at it from a design point, not necessarily what the light is for it. When I first got to know Roger and we had our house and I tried to buy a lamp, I learned that quickly. It really matters the kind of light that's coming out.
I'm actually really interested in how that whole change in technology, I started off with, I used brute arcs. Not much, but it was like the last days of using brute arcs, as a regular lamp. And now it's LEDs, and you've got such a variety of LEDs. You go to the trade shows, and it's like you're overwhelmed with the different manufacturers, all with a different approach and a different sort of lighting technology. But how's that changed your job over the years?
It's funny because sometimes, just talking from the standpoint of what's presented from, the set decorator and the set dressers. And the art department, sometimes they'll build, like we were doing a job with Larry called The Bride, which is coming up coming out soon, and set in the 30s, and clearly pre-LED, so there was a lot of they were designing a lot of signs, and in addition to being LED, and the newness that didn't exist back in the day, they're also I think this is part of where we need to have these departments talking and working together more closely. They're very expensive. LEDs, that technology is very expensive, and it's and sometimes they'll design things like LED as per electrics on the design drawings. They'll design something that's very, very shallow, where only an LED can. You need something that's as thin as an LED ribbon to be able to do the job. And what and meanwhile, we're on this job when they're trying to say from the beginning, we don't have a lot of money, so you've got to be as efficient as possible. So I started thinking like, well, how about this? Let's stop designing LED fixtures that necessitate LEDs, especially when we're representing a time that didn't have LEDs. So let's go with this time period, and maybe we're putting bulbs into these things, and maybe that's part of the charm. It's a sign that where you see a little bit of a hot spot and a little bit of a shadow, and maybe that adds to the, in addition to saving money and and allowing us to use that money for more important things. That sign in the background now, instead of being $500 to $1,000 worth of LED install with the controller and the whole thing and into a data network, let's maybe it's just 6 bulbs in a thing, and it feels more antique, and and
cheaper.
It's in the background, and it's tungsten, and it fits into the technology of the day, and it just it helps us all the way around. So that things like that, or sometimes that's the way to go.
I remember going. Couple of things, really. I was flummoxed when I think it was Skyfall, I came into a set we were pre-lighting, and the dimmer operator was standing in the middle of the set on his iPhone, as I thought he was on his iPhone making a call or texting, but he actually wasn't. He was adjusting the lights. And I thought in that situation, it was quite a complex rig, so I thought that's great. But then on the opposite side of that, I was shooting in a tiny little room with like 4 or 5 little practicals that I just thought it was all tungsten bulbs, and we would just put little squeeze dimmers on the floor or hide them on the floor. But oh no, they were all on all back to a desk. And I thought sometimes, do you find it's like, sometimes it's like overthink? Where you're talking about doing a job where it's like you use practical lights in the old school, and you just I mean, it used to work, but now things seem to have got so
funny.
complicated
And, and going back to the same job, The Bride, we had a location that was in Staten Island, and it was Snug Harbor, which is sort of a collection of historic buildings, and and it kind of knew where we were going to be shooting, but it was a little. Again, it was like this sort of this bubble of protection, mentality of like, well, let's make sure that we can swing the camera around, and because there was some action and things like this. And again, confronted with this situation where we didn't, we knew we had to cut costs somewhere, and so I said to Larry, I said, well, maybe this location, maybe this is a location where, again, we're in the 30s, we're dealing with all kind of warm tungsten sources. There's no pretty uniform in that sense. And I said, well, maybe we just go into this one, instead of laying in this massive data network for the interiors and exteriors and go through all this, laying this gigantic infrastructure. What if we go tungsten all the way, and we'll get 20 variacs and and squeezers and whatever, and we'll just put this soft light in this old zip light in a window well, and we'll put that in it, and if things dim down, that's okay, because it's all sort of kind of fits into this sort of warm aesthetic. And he said, yeah, you know what, that'd be great. Let's do that. And he's like-minded in that sense that he kind of, also, it's kind of fun to, break out of this, like, let's change gears. Let's not just, go on this, with this preconceived idea that everything has to be LED. Let's be open to some flexibility. And the funniest thing about that was all the young technicians that we had as additionals had never seen a variac before. So,
wow.
So
wow,
isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? You think that that's So the first, and I saw it coming. It's like, okay, I see. I know what's going to happen here. So as soon as they called us in, I said, okay, guys, everybody over here, we're going to have a quick 5-minute lesson on how to use variacs. So I said, just make sure we get a couple different kinds so we can show them all the little intricacies. And of course they overvolted a couple bulbs, and I said, that's okay. That's why I remember we talked about that. That's, so it was a good, like, sort of retro lesson. It was like, it's like, learning how to drive stick shift or something like that,
Yeah, right. Do people still use gels?
It's on the last job we did. I was working with Don Burgess, who I know you had as a guest.
Oh, right.
We had to do a scene where it was a setting sun, like an exterior. We were out, an intersection, kind of thing. And so, Don said, "Oh, we can get an 18K and put some heavy, put some full O on it." And I said, or we could get a 24 light Dino with some narrow bulbs. I'm thinking a little bit like, this is what, like, again, it's like going through this, like our catalog of experiences. I'm thinking, well, it worked for Vittorio pretty well. That could be a fun thing to, try. So he said, oh yeah, we could do that, and he fortunately, he's seasoned enough to remember all those lights, and he's used all the lights. So I was introducing something he was completely unfamiliar with. So, but it was funny, even, and I figured, nobody's going to complain about what this cost, because the rental house is probably going to, if anything, send a thank you note for sending this out on a job, because that's something they don't have to, right. It's funny you said, because it's exactly what Don said. He said, oh, what if they, he was kind of giving me a hard time about it, kind of just jokingly saying like, oh, what if they have to dust that off for you? It's like, whose side do you want? I thought we were going to be the champions of this thing. I thought you'd be on my side here a little bit more, but he was just giving me a hard time, but it was funny. But no, we still, the gels come out occasionally. The gels have to come out, and sometimes it's trying to mix these LED emitters on different brands of lights to get the same color is so tricky that sometimes you just have to, set them all for 32, which is, the broad spectrum emitter, which I've, learned over, all these years as the LEDs have, they started making LEDs before we understood how to use them. So it's funny how we're kind of, even the manufacturers are kind of catching up, saying, yeah, we didn't really know what we were doing back then, but now we've kind of figured it out. So, but you set them all for 32, and that's their best rendering kind of, color. And then, in terms of making them all uniform, and then you can add the color to those, and then suddenly it's like, okay, now they're matching, whereas if I tried to do the mix of all the crazy different emitters that, they all have different packages of emitters and colors and things like that. It's just, it doesn't always line up, and it can be nerve wracking. And
yeah. I wanted to ask you, have you ever had the experience, and you don't have to name names, but where the directors come up to you, the gaffer, to tell you something and isn't going through the DP necessarily? And I think that you think your job is to do what the DP wants. So what do you do in that kind of situation?
I mean,
or what would
not
you
too
do?
much. I'm thinking if I can't even think of a specific situation, but I think if, I always take that as, and usually they're not trying to sidestep the cinematographer, or sneak something in. I think it usually, they might, the convenience of I'm standing there might be a case where they would mention it to me. And I think, in that kind of situation, I would sort of say, I would listen to what they're saying and say, sure, it's possible, probably. And then I would, maybe the DP's in the restroom, and then they come back to set, and I'll say, oh, by the way, they so-and-so mentioned that they wanted to try this. So we're starting to work on that, but let me know if you want to do something different or modify, just to be, include them in, so I wouldn't operate, autonomous. I wouldn't go rogue on somebody, I don't think, in that situation. So, or hopefully not. Because I'm there to support them. I mean, first and foremost, I'm there to support the cinematographer and not kind of create confusion in the sort of the line of communication.
Well, there's a reason that there are lines of communication, and it's funny because when you start a job, oftentimes you realize you're with a bunch of people that don't realize that, and that will go to an individual and give pertinent information that actually needs to go to a number of departments. And being on jobs like that, you just generally, the crew learns to check in with each other every day and say, what have you heard? Oh, there's a new scene? Oh, good to know.
I know it. Everybody's they're afraid to give out false information, so then you end up on the other side of the flip side, where you're getting lack of information. So it's like, well, I know you didn't want to tell any of the wrong thing, but I wish you'd told me something about what it might be. It's like I'm less likely to bite your head off. I'm not going to bite your head off at all, but usually, I would be less likely to if I, if you just kind of gave me a hint of what was possible. I wouldn't, wouldn't come back and say, well, you said it was a 50% chance, and it was only a 30% chance. But.
I was on a movie as a script supervisor and spent 2 weeks with the director and the actors, and they were rewriting the scripts constantly. So every day, at the end of the day, I would call the prop department, the art department, all of that. Listen, it's not official yet, but you might need to find a cherry red convertible, that kind of thing. You need the time to find. You just give them a heads up so they can source it and maybe not buy it. But
have you ever had the situation? I remember Dick Bush telling me about, he was shooting Tommy with Ken Russell, and he had done this sort of pre-light of this church or cathedral, and it was all shot for one direction, and that was all supposed to be just this one shot. And Ken came in the next day, the day of the shoot, and looked at it and decided to shoot in absolutely the reverse direction with all Dick's lights in shot.
Yeah.
Have you ever had that?
Oh yeah. Well, it's funny,
Did you, like Dick Bush, though, leave the lights in shot, whoever the cinematographer was? Dick Bush just left it. He's like, oh, what the hell?
I don't think I've done that. But I definitely, it's funny. Like I could think of a time, on like on Bridge of Spies, Steven Spielberg is, a lot of, he's got so many irons and so many fires that, a lot of the time he's not on tech scouts. And I actually didn't even meet him until the first day of shooting, which is also coincidentally the first day I met Mitch Lillian, because Mitch Lillian was coming off of another job. So I met Mitch and Steven Spielberg the same morning, but.
All right. Oh, well, lucky you to meet Mitch.
So, but there were, because of that, there were times where Steven had, maybe he'd been shown the locations in some form, but wasn't that familiar. So I remember we were walking out of one of the sort of alleyways where, for one of the scenes where Tom Hanks is being followed through the rain. and we were company moving from another place. And so we were kind of arriving, and Steven, of course, got there early, and we kind of, were coming up behind him. And Steven was looking down the alley the other way. We'd rigged it one direction, and it was a, period film. So we kind of felt like we were kind of safe, but, it was night and things like that. And Steven sees something, he wants it, because
he wants
it. So Janusz was running up behind us. Says, "No, Steven, it's this way. It's this." It's like, "No, Steven, no, it's over here." Kind of like he wasn't going to go over there to be seen against that background. It's like, no, we're planting our feet. You're going to have to talk to us. You're going to have to look around and talk to us this direction. So, but
right.
There's for certainly with Steven, there's
that's funny.
It's happened, and it's funny when it does happen, because we do go through a lot of plans to sort of get things in place for, to make sure that, God forbid, he comes in and we're looking the direction he said we'd look in, and we're not ready. So it's like we have no choice but to prepare that view and prioritize that a direction. But sometimes he comes in and he's so focused on, well, of course, the storytelling, and he's so, he's got the certain priorities, of what he's trying to get and the information he's trying to convey in a scene. And if certain elements aren't right, if those elements aren't the important elements, then he really doesn't, he is willing to look past that. Like, that doesn't bother him, to have those things. Of course, he has, there's enough budget where, in post they can kind of can help out too. But it's he's very good at kind of, in a way, ignoring some of those things that in the end don't maybe matter. It's like he's so good at directing the viewer's eye that you're watching the scene, and there might be even equipment in the shot, and and we're watching the film for the first time thinking, oh no, here's that part where we thought we might have left that light, and that and they're going to catch it. And and you're watching the scene, and it's like you realize after you're on to the next scene. It's like, I forgot to look. I was just thinking about, it was just one scene before I was ready to look for it, and then suddenly I was so into the story that I forgot to even check. It's remarkable that he can do that.
Yeah. But okay, so somebody starting out wants to get into film and into lighting and being a gaffer. It sounds like your training in computer science actually came very invaluable in the world you work in today.
Goodness. Yeah, it's like, as the business has changed so much, and what it meant to work with a truckload of tungsten lights to now having a truckload of computer networking equipment it's so different. I was joking, I don't know if it was with Mitch, and saying that, it's like you took a soccer team, and said, last season, and said, okay, next season you're going to be a hockey team. It's like you have to, same basic objectives. You're trying to get the thing in the net, but now you're going to have to do it with skates, and it's like it's like a whole new skill set that's completely separate from where we started. So,
mind you, my soccer team, Manchester United, might be better off playing hockey right now. Anyway,
there always has to be a comment on
this. So you think somebody starting out really kind of needs to know more about
technology,
these sort of systems?
I think it's a huge advantage for people starting out. And I actually have been last 3 or 4 years. I've been started teaching this lighting workshop up in Maine, in Rockport, near Rockport, Maine. It used to be the Maine Photographic Workshops. Now it's called Maine Media, and it's been around for 50 years. 50 plus years. So,
forever.
I actually found out. Past year, I was looking at some of the photos and things they had on the wall, and I was like, "Oh, here's a picture of Conrad Hall." And it said Conrad Hall. They said, "Oh yeah, Conrad Hall taught the first lighting class at this school." I thought, "Oh, that's okay, good. Pretty good company. Yeah, I know it.
Good company to be in."
But I tell the students, some of them are young, some of them aren't. It's a diverse group of people that come to the class, and that's great. But I kind of talk to the young ones. I said, you guys are really, at a, huge advantage here because, they see me, teaching the class and even I'm learning the lights because there's lights that, they have, they try to get, the newest lights and there's lights that, that I'm seeing for the first time. So I said, you see me trying to learn this, I'm teaching the class and I've never even touched this light before. So that's you're only, or I'm using the app on the iPad to control the lights, in the class using the blackout app,
Right.
which is a great little dimmer console for the iPad. One year I was doing it, and there was a brand new update to the software. I said, "Excuse me, guys." I said, "But this update just came out last week, so there's a little hiccup here. It's because I'm just learning this thing, which puts me maybe only a week ahead of you guys, and you guys have never seen this before. So it's like it's a good opportunity. I think it's a good time for young people, and
that's encouraging.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for this.
Good.
This has been great
Thank you so
and
much.
so
I really
interesting.
appreciate it.
Yeah. If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.